for years for someone to do this project. It's because people would come to the Santa Barbara Mission Archive. They would look up their family ancestry and they'd be like, why is this person listed as a Pardo here? Pardo is colonial speak for somebody of African descent.
I'm Damian Bacich, and this is the California Frontier Show, where we take deep dives into aspects of California history that you may or may not have learned in school. And one of the things that I consciously try to do on this show is to bring out overlooked or perhaps counterintuitive aspects of California history, especially its early history. And my guest today is Dr. Cameron Jones. And he is going to tell us about an aspect of California history we rarely hear about, California's early African descendants. Now, Cameron is an award-winning author who has multiple publications to his credit. And regarding this topic, he is the co-editor of At the Heart of the Borderlands, which is the first book-length study of Africans and Afro-descendants on the frontiers of the Spanish Empire in the Americas. But in particular, what I wanted him to talk about was an initiative that he started where he teaches at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, California Polytechnic State University in San Luis Obispo, California. He has, along with some other colleagues, started a website called African-Californios.org. And it's a research project based out of Cal Poly's Institute for Advanced Technology and Public Policy. And it's really cool because it uses tools from computing and data science to study the lives of people of African descent who played important roles in California during the Spanish, Mexican, and the early American periods. And if you go on the website, you'll see it has maps with concentrations of people of African descent in California between 1769 and 1850. It's got biographies of a number of Californios of African descent, including probably the most well-known, Pio Pico, who was the last Mexican governor of California. It's got photos, lists of descendants, and it's growing all the time as more data get input to it. So if you're interested in California's Black history, especially in the early years, I'd say it's one of, if not the premier place to go. So with that intro, let's get into the interview with Dr. Cameron Jones. Before we get into the whole subject, it'd be cool if you would tell us a little bit about your background and actually how you got into the subject that we're going to talk about today.
Okay, yeah. So I actually started in working on Andean history. Was My PhD was on missionaries, Franciscan missionaries, kind of the same missionaries that came to California, went to the Andes. In basically the eastern Amazonian jungles of Peru, a group called the Missionaries of Santa Rosa de Copa. Um, so my first book was on these missions in very similar situation to what you have in California, kind of a frontier area. And as I was doing that book, I saw all these people, all these Africans that were popping up, enslaved Africans that were subject to the missions, and maybe it was a little unclear if some of them were free. And When I was finishing that up, I was actually here visiting my parents. I actually didn't have the job at Cal Poly. I'm actually from San Luis Obispo, and I thought, oh, there's a mission archive nearby. I'll just go see what there's there. And I had that in the back of my mind, and I started talking to Monica Orozco, who was at the time the archivist there. She now runs the whole mission complex there. She's the executive director, I believe is her official title. And I mentioned, I'm kind of interested. Were there people, blacks or people of African descent in the missions? And she looked at me in the eyes and said, I've been waiting for years for someone to do this project. And I'm like, okay, well then now I'm doing this project. That is how this project goes. So that's kind of a dramatic beginning. Um, and so as I was finishing up my other book, I started to do research on it and kind of shift. It wasn't as big of a shift as I thought it would be because, it's looking at the Franciscan missions here as opposed to Peru, kind of the same guys. They're in the same pipeline coming out of Spain through this institution, kind of apostolic colleges, right? So the one in San Fernando that's over California is similar to the one in Peru. So yeah, started looking at that, and that's how the story started. So then I ended up getting offered a job here at Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, and I've been here for about 12 years, teaching and writing. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into the current project.
That's it's funny there's some parallels with my story because I came from more literature linguistics side, but I worked on Inca Garcilaso de la Vega and from Peru, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And then when I came to also being from California, when I got my job at San Jose State, one of the first things I did is go to the California room, it's called, there at our library, and asked them if they had anything in Spanish, and came across all of these documents from the 1830s and 40s, and that kind of set me on the path to really work on something that was local and that was tied to our history here in California. So that's really cool, and I think that that's one of the things that if we're curious enough about where we are, it can kind of lead you down that path. The other thing you mentioned that I really like is what Monica said, because I was about to say that to you too. Was I'm so glad this is a topic that I've wanted to explore on this podcast, and so I'm glad there's finally somebody really digging into it. So yeah.
yeah. I mean, it's a complicated topic, and it opens up a lot of cans of worms, as as they would say, with just both how the history actually happened and also how it's been perceived over time, right?
Well, what's your starting point? Where did you start, and where is it taking you so far?
Yeah, so my starting point was just there what Monica actually took me to was a questionnaire. It's a well-known questionnaire. It gets answered here in California 1813, 1814. Um, and it's as a result of the Cortes of Cadiz. So the French take over Spain. There's this kind of rump of the Spanish Parliament left in Cadiz, and they write a new constitution. And that constitution grants universal male suffrage throughout the whole empire, with some exceptions. And so the second thing they do is send a survey out, like, well, who did we just give the right to vote? Which they may have thought of, perhaps should have thought of before they did that, but okay. And this questionnaire gets to California, and I started reading it and realizing how much, one, the missionaries actually didn't want to talk about this that much, because the questionnaire was actually very specific. It wanted them to talk about all the castas, or the castes, kind of the colonial equivalent of what we would call race now. And the one that really got me was San Luis Obispo, because I'm from San Luis Obispo, and it said that 5 of the 6 soldiers here were mulattoes, people of mixed African ancestry. And so that was my starting point, where I was kind of hooked. I was like, oh, whoa. Growing up here, no one talked about that, right? It was the Spanish, and it was the indigenous population and the conflicts there, but kind of complicating the term we were using for Spanish, right? That most of these guys were not Spanish. Some were, especially the missionaries and some of the soldiers, but I think it's a recognition now that most of the soldiers and most of the settlers are from Mexico, of various kind of racial backgrounds, mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European descent, mulattoes, and there's even some identified as negros, so blacks, people who are kind of considered full African. I say considered because obviously this is a construction, social construction that is being these titles actually being put on them, but it indicates definitely a more interesting, more kind of multi-racial, maybe multi-ethnic background of what became known as the Californios. So this is kind of where I started out here.
So, can you tell us a little bit about any of those soldiers that you came across?
I mean, yeah. So the original census, I actually still trying to track back, but a lot of these soldiers actually end up becoming the elites in California. So probably the best known would be Santiago Pico, who is comes as a child from his father brings him here. His mother is a mulata, right, a woman of indigenous, or sorry, of African and European descent, and he starts this dynasty, the Pico family, right? And we have Picos everywhere in California. Of course, the most famous being Pio Pico, who becomes the Mexican governor of California, the last Mexican governor of California. His brother Andres is a general that fights the Americans in the Mexican-American War. Uh, um, and you have others, Turcio Tapia. These guys become big holders of ranchos. They are some of the wealthiest people in California, alongside others that were considered, more or less Spanish. Now, it's interesting. This title, Spanish. Bob Sankiewicz, who you might know, is one of the
Absolutely.
well-known historians. I had a Zoom meeting with him, just kind of picking his brain about some of this stuff, and he said, to be honest, everybody but the missionaries and the high officers were probably not Españoles, unless they were from Spain, right? Unless they're from someplace in Spain, so the Catalan volunteers, so I think these terms are kind of wishy-washy at times, but nonetheless, yeah, the Picos, the Tapias, these all become really important families that a lot of the current, descendants are descended from, and own some of the biggest ranchos around. For example, Pio Pico's cousin, um, his nickname was Tontoy Pico, owned the Piedras Blancas Ranch here in in San Luis Obispo County, which later got bought by George Hearst and became the Hearst property. It's part of the Hearst properties.
Wow.
Yeah, and he actually was almost executed by John C. Fremont um, here in the Plaza of San Luis Obispo for uh, he got he got captured and then paroled, and then he fought again against the Americans, and so for breaking parole, he was going to be hanged. But there's this great dramatic moment where his wife comes and begs for his life, and Fremont frees him. Although there's kind of an implication that Fremont did this for political reasons, like it had been all arranged beforehand that this would happen. Which, if you know anything about Fremont, he was quite good at reading the political situation, and executing the Mexican governor's cousin probably was a bad idea uh, um, politically, right? So
So,
these,
Jade, sorry, just to pause for people who may not be in on everything. So, Charles C. Fremont, the Army officer who came to California originally on a geographic expedition, or at least that was the cover, and then wound up later leading the sort of the Mexican American War effort in California to annex California, right?
yeah,
And
and
later
later
ran for office and ran for governor, if I'm not mistaken. Right?
I believe he becomes senator, runs for governor unsuccessfully, I think is the what happened with him. She ran for president at one point as well. So he was quite an active person in the politics of not just California but the United States. Yeah. So these guys are everywhere. Yeah. I talked to you earlier, and this is kind of what I've been really focusing on the last few weeks is the founders of Los Angeles.
Yeah,
Uh, ha
please.
yeah, half the founders of Los Angeles were identified as either being negros or mulattoes, right? And so, of the 44 people, about 22 of them are of African descent. And
So when you
so,
say, sorry to interrupt, but when you say the founders of Los Angeles, you mean the people that came in 1781?
yeah, so they came on the Rivera expedition. and this had been already arranged by the Spanish government that they would come to this area. Uh, it was interesting. The priest that kind of identified what became Los Angeles as a good area. The reason why is he says, "Well, there's an indigenous village there, so it must be a good place to live."
Right, which makes sense because they knew there's probably water, food.
Of course, sorry. Of course, the indigenous people probably didn't think very highly of that situation, being forced out of the Tongva village that was there. But so they come in 1781, and they kind of the founding documents November 4th, and they list their casta, this kind of racial designation, and half of them are mulattoes or negros. Now, two of the men who are the only two actually I can find in any California census that were listed as negro as opposed to a mulatto. So somebody who is perceived to be of kind of pure African ancestry as opposed to somebody of mixed African and European ancestry as a
Because
mulatto.
they weren't doing DNA testing
They
at the
weren't, yeah.
time.
So it's all perception, of
Mm,
course. Um, they later they almost immediately leave Los Angeles, and so this has been kind of one of those California mysteries for a while. In the 1930s, it was said that they were expelled, but some later research by Mason, who's probably one of the best demographers on California, William M. Mason, um, he looked into it and he's like, actually, these guys asked to leave. One of them wanted to go back to Mexico. He was a miner there in Sonora and wanted to go back to wherever he was from. And then Luis Quintero ends up in Santa Barbara. His daughters had married some soldiers in the Santa Barbara Presidio. He ends up going up there. He's a tailor by profession, and it's thought that that was a place where he could be a tailor because to fix the soldiers' uniforms. Uh,
sure.
right. And so he becomes an important staple there in Santa Barbara, dies in 1824. So he's there, at least 40 odd years living in Santa Barbara. Um, so it's interesting because you have this kind of perception that they were expelled, um, but that's not necessarily true. And so one of the kind of questions that I'm still trying to ask myself is, right, what effect did race have on these individual standings within, early California society? And the answer is somewhat complicated. I don't know if, certainly within the Spanish system, they couldn't rise to higher ranks, right? They, in most cases, they weren't officers. There's actually an interesting case with Santiago Pico. If you look at the 1790 Spanish census, kind of the first and only complete census of Spanish California, uh, his siblings are all listed as mulattoes. He's listed as an Espanol, and it's thought that they did that because they were wanting to make him an officer. He was a non-commissioned officer, and he was a sergeant, right? And they thought, well, we can't list him as a mulatto in the census, so let's list him as an Espanol. And then he actually never ended up getting becoming an officer, which maybe shows some of the limitations we're talking about here. Um, and so, right, but being in California and the Spanish and then later kind of Mexican governments being so desperate for anybody to come up here uh, opens up some opportunities for these guys to especially when ranchos get started handed out with the dissolution of the missions, right? They start taking apart mission lands and handing out those lands. These guys having military service, having lived here, were well placed to get those lands. And so it's kind of a complicated, like, what does this actually mean? My favorite part is at the end of the Mexican period, when it becomes the United States and you have the 1850 census, the United States Census. Pio Pico, for example, is listed as white in the 1850 census. And although he is actually never listed as mulatto in any census, and that has a lot to do with they kind of stopped listing race after a while. Um, you know,
In Mexico, you mean?
in Mexico, yeah.
Hmm.
The last time they do is 1821. There's an LA census. And they're starting to use more kind of modern racial terms, so colors, right? They'll
Mm.
say blanco for Mestizo, they start saying rosado, which is pretty hilarious. Because
Interesting.
rosado, if you don't know, is pink in Spanish.
Mm-hmm,
So it's kind of like they're red, like, Indian red, quote unquote, right?
mm-hmm,
They're red-ish. They're
mm-hmm,
pink.
mm-hmm.
But that's the kind of the last census I can find where race is listed until the United States takes over. But then a lot of these guys get listed as white. And I think part of it is, Pio Pico was pretty dark skinned. You look at a picture of him. Whatever you want to say he is, it's kind of one of those other issues. But he's rich, he's powerful, and also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo guaranteed that all of the formerly Mexican citizens in this, the annexed territory would have quote full rights of citizen. In 19 1840s, 1850s United States, that was white. So they get all listed as white in the 1850 census. So, it's kind of a complicated history that I'm trying to figure out because I think it's important that we uh, think about this, right? Some people are going to be like, "Oh, you're bringing race into it," and I'm like, "Well, yes, but I'm also in a way that maybe even they wouldn't have accepted." But also, I'm trying to reclaim some, Black history, some African descendant history, right? These individuals, why do they hide their race? Well, they hide it because of the inability to climb socially, and so, and the limitations that they were facing, even in a kind of a Wild West place like California.
So, well, I've got two or three questions that come to mind. One, let's dial it all the way back to Sonora, where most of these pobladores came from. It makes me think I don't know if you've dug into that aspect of it, but it makes me think about, what was the population in Sonora that would have sort of a high percentage of African descendants, one would think, or was the number of African descendants that came here in California partially a self-selecting group that didn't reflect the overall population? Have you thought about that at all or
Yeah.
speculated?
So I I've speculated. I thought about it. I'm in contact with some historians down in Mexico that study the demographics of Sonora to try to maybe answer some of these questions. As of yet, I don't have good evidence. Back 2023, I actually was the editor on a book called "At the Heart of the Borderlands," which is actually about this phenomenon of people of African descent tending towards border areas like Sonora, right? California, you got to think of actually as the border of the border, right? Sonora was a borderland. California is like way out there. Uh, I didn't realize this until I actually went to the Archive of the Indies in Spain, and the way they describe California is like, oh yeah, there's this place way out there that there's some people at, right? In the way that they're describing California. Um, but there's this tendency, uh, because in more, government-controlled central areas like Mexico City or even Guadalajara, which was the audiencia capital that oversaw California. Um, uh, you you have this, these barriers to kind of higher social echelons for any people of color, but particularly people of African descent, right? There was this kind of idea that people of indigenous descent, right, were neophytes. They were new converts, and so they could be made to be good Christians, and therefore, maybe not equal to people of European descent, but could somehow, climb this kind of social hierarchy. But people of African descent, because of their association with slavery, they really made it very difficult. And so there's this movement all throughout Spanish America, which is what the book focused on. From Texas to California to Argentina, people of African descent moving to borderlands as a way of, being able to climb the social hierarchy, right, in a way that they couldn't elsewhere. And so I think that's part of it. Of course, that could also mean they're self-selecting because they're in Sonora, right? And they're like, in fact, they offered them money to go to California. They would pay them for the first little bit. So they're saying, oh, even here, there's probably some prejudice against you. Here's an even more farther place that's even more, wild, and we just need desperate for as they would call themselves, gente de razón, people of reason,
Mm-hmm.
meaning that they were Catholic and spoke Spanish. Essentially,
Mm-hmm.
is how you could define that. We don't care what you look like, as long as you come and you kind of carry the banner of Spain to this far off place. And so, I my guess is this is a little bit of both, right? There were already a large population of people of African descent in these frontier areas. And whether, Sonora is where the Rivera expedition's supposed to launch from. But if you look at the numbers, Sonora is probably the second most common place people are from. Sinaloa is the number one, which is just south of Sonora. So, it's not
Gotcha.
not that far away. It's also just across the Gulf of California from Baja California. So there's, geographically makes sense. And they also had a large African population. The port there, Mazatlan, which is people know because they go on vacation there, was originally called Mazatlan de los Morenos, Mazatlan
Mm,
of the black people,
hmm.
right? So the name alone tells
That
you
tells you
that
something.
something is going on there. So uh, yeah,
What about under U.S. occupation and later U.S. statehood? You mentioned that especially the elite among them were oftentimes classified as Spanish, Espanol under Spain and Mexico, but then under the U.S. they were listed as white, say in the census. But informally, was there prejudice, difficulty, racism that they had to deal with despite their official census classification?
yeah.
Or do you
So there,
know? Do we know?
yeah. So there's some informal. Yeah, I mean, you're right to ask that. There is some informal evidence to suggest that they weren't accepted locally. Um, there's a case down in San Bernardino where a couple was going to get married, and the husband was viewed by, this is right after California statehood, so viewed by the U.S. official down there as being black, and the community just couldn't understand. They're like, "What do you mean?" They're like,
Mm.
"Well, interracial marriage is illegal in the United States at this time." And they're like, "Well, we're the same class. Like, I don't understand." The man was wealthy. Um, this also might, and this is, what I'm thinking about working on, play into the decline of the power of the Californios, right? So when the California becomes a state, they're still very powerful. The 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 Constitution, the California Constitution, it's written in 1849, and it's ratified in 1850. Um, it's written both in English and Spanish. 8 of the 40 people at the convention are Californios. The convention is bilingual, right? Just kind of gives you an idea of the power of the Californios still at the birth of statehood. Within a few decades, they're all out of power. They lose their land. This is, famously, the U.S. government made them show up in San Francisco and defend their land grants.
Right.
Uh, as a kid, I was taught actually that they lost most of those cases. That's actually not true. They overwhelmingly won the cases, but in doing so, it bankrupts them. Uh, and the taxes that were being levied bankrupt them, and there was a lot more push for agriculture as opposed to ranching, which was what, planting crops as opposed to 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 raising cattle, livestock. Is what they were focused on. Um,
And so many of them had to mortgage or sell or give their property to the very lawyers that were defending them in order to
right,
keep their court cases going.
right. And so yeah, they have to essentially buy, and then there's a big drought in the 1860s, which kills
Right.
off all the cattle. Um, so there's factors going on there, but one would wonder if, you know, race had a way of playing into that. And that's something that I haven't found the smoking gun yet. But I do know that a lot of the grants that were given by Pio Pico were denied in that process, disproportionately more. Now, there's some issues with the timing of that because he was giving them out at the last minute before the transfer of power.
Right.
So that's what there's a Supreme Court case actually where they hear it, And they're like, you just backdated this. He gave this out after, the treaty was ratified. Um, and they lose the case and it doesn't go anywhere. But is that a factor? These are some of the questions I still haven't quite answered. I'm still, the project's ongoing. Um, kind of waiting, trying to get funding to keep this going. Yeah.
Have you noticed any? And you mentioned you're focusing on Los Angeles, the Pueblo of Los Angeles, but have you been able to look into differences or continuities between, say, the experience of African descendant Californios, let's say, in Southern California and in the northern area of the territory?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. They certainly were more concentrated in the South,
Yeah, it
although
seems like that.
there were some that were significant. Good example, Juana Briones, who is a
Juana
famous,
Briones, right?
yeah, she's of African descent. Um, in fact, I'm pretty sure the picture that everyone says is her is actually not her,
Yeah, I don't think so either.
because it matches. Oh, you've seen it. Okay, so we're on the same page because there's a
Yeah.
painting of her and it looks nothing like the painting. Um, and so
And you want to, I'm going to just to
yeah.
interrupt, sorry. In the Los Gatos Museum several years ago, did a exhibit about Juana Briones, and there were a couple of photos of nieces of hers, and it from the end of the 19th century, and they didn't look anything like that picture that you often see. And that sort of made me think, well, at least here's a close relative. So that can give us an idea of what she may have looked like.
Yeah, and again, I'm not really using pictures because race is a perception, and there's a reason I use the term African descended, because I'm just interested in whether ancestry and how that
Yeah.
might affect them going forward. It's a tricky game, right? Because I can't necessarily, race is what the community and themselves decide it is, right? So
Yeah.
it's a social construct. So I can't go back 100 years and construct my own social situation.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
so she's of African descent, right? And a significant player, but they definitely were not as important in the politics of the North. And I have speculated, and still again working on evidence here, that might have been the cause of some of the friction between the North and the South. So particularly during the Mexican period, right? You have the Jose Castro, who does have some African descent, but is generally considered to be an Espanol, and Pio Pico in the South, and his people in the South, right? Of where the power of California lies. Does it lie in the South or in the North, right? Part of the problem is a lot of these conflicts just get buried by the gold rush, right? By
Right.
so many Anglos coming in that it doesn't really even matter after 1849, because the power has tipped away from the Californios and all these Anglo-Americans showing up. Uh, so it's a little bit hard because that masks, I think, how it would have played out with a little bit better documentation, that they have to kind of band together because they now have a common foe, which is the 49ers coming in. Uh,
And it seems that in Southern California, there is more of a coherence, a community coherence among Mexican Californians, let's say, than in the North. I think in the North, communities are maybe more dispersed. You don't have, um, a real population axis like Los Angeles, even though you have the Pueblo of San Jose. But I think that the people are more dispersed, and there's less of sort of a even a political community in the North as opposed to Southern California.
And I also think that San Francisco Bay plays a factor because you have more outside, uh, you know,
Right,
interference in San Francisco, right? Los Angeles has a port, but it's not really that great until they build out all the jetties. It's an okay port, right? Whereas San Francisco from the beginning was a fantastic port, and so most of the shipping's going up into that area, and you get a lot of Englishmen, for example.
right.
And they, I mean, they do mix in with the population, William Hartnell, or as I like to call him, Guillermo Arnell, as he later became known.
Right, 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 right.
He plays an important factor, and Pio Pico is educated by him, right?
Hmm.
So I mean, there is that mix, and it mostly takes place in Monterey, is kind of the where the two sides meet. But yeah, I would agree with you that there's definitely, and the demographics hold that out, right? Where there's definitely more of a Afro-descendant community in the South as opposed to the North. And I think it also helps that you have, these big families of African ancestry, like the Picos, that kind of hold that all together, because it's very much it's a familial connections. Uh, we're currently building out. So part of this project is we're building a website, AfricanCalifornios.org. Um,
Yeah, describe the project a little bit.
yeah, so it's a project that I started. When I started this, I realized that um, the kind of classic historical records, it's going to be difficult, just because the way that they describe themselves in these records. So you're going to need to use some census data, family trees, build some family trees. And so I started looking at, fortunately in California, we have the Early California Populations Project. And a shout out to Steve Hackle there. Um, but you know, we have such great resources electronically, and so much is digitized that it's compared to other places I've worked in Latin America. I don't study U.S. In other parts of the U.S. they probably have similar great resources, but in Latin America we don't. And so um, I started looking at that, and it was a little bit beyond my skill level as a historian of doing the data science necessary. So I teamed up with my research partner is a guy named Fawad Kasmood, who's a professor of computer science and software engineering at Cal Poly, and we started building a database, essentially taking those who are identified as being of African descent in the few censuses we have where that's identified, and then building out their family tree to see, um, who they're related to, uh, whether this is just, you know, a little bit by the end, it's kind of everybody. Um, right. I think certain families more so than others, right? But everybody a little bit has some sort of, you know mixture of racial origins. Um, and part of that was to try to reconstruct the concept of like a community, right? Like, are these people living together like in Southern California? That's kind of been the big revelation, is that Southern California is kind of the epicenter of this community, right? Whatever that means to them, of people of African descent.
Can I interrupt really
Yeah,
quick?
go ahead.
Did you find any sort of evidence of a community consciousness of of Californios of African descent, or was it something that you really have to kind of tease out from the historical data?
It's something you
Did
really have.
people, yeah, did people talk about it, or did they gather together, or yeah,
So far, I haven't found any evidence of them talking about it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen,
right,
right? Because a lot of what happens, especially with, um, uh, as we say in history, racism is structural, right? And so a lot of what happens with racial divisions is the unsaid things, right? Why do some people live in some communities and some people live in other communities,
sure,
right? What policies led them to do that? For example, San Luis Obispo, where I live right now, is about 70% white, as they would define it in the census. 40 miles south of here, Santa Maria, is overwhelmingly Hispanic, right? Okay, there's no policy that created that, but it shows something, right? That
yeah,
there's something going on there. That there's some sort of racial difference,
mm-hmm.
if not disparity between the two. And so, I think it's more that kind of thing that we're going to be able to find more than them calling it out. Possibly, probably because those themselves who could have been identified as being of African descent didn't want to be identified as such.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to avoid that label as much as possible. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it didn't affect their where they lived, who they associated with, who they married, right? And so these are the things that, on the kind of the data science side, we're trying to tease out these kind of deeper societal the fabric of the society. And so far, that's where the evidence is leaning. Where there was somewhat of a geographic, you know, it was more people of Africa. They weren't spread evenly over California. They tended to live in certain areas, and it tended to associate with certain families. So that's going to be, I think, the bigger story here of understanding what actually was going on.
You talked about censuses. What about baptismal records? When children were baptized, I know from my own research, there's definitely distinction between, say, razón or neófito or what
Uh-huh.
have you. I don't recall. Does that, say, mulatto or what have you? Does that appear in baptismal records, or is it mainly in the census?
Yeah, it's mainly in the census. Very rarely, and this is actually an aberration. California, in Mexico, they would have listed race at birth. So if you look at the censuses, even in northern Mexico, they were listing, their parents are this, use the colonial term caste, casta, right?
Mm-hmm.
Are this caste? The mother's this and the father's this, and so the child's this. California, it's extremely rare. I believe there's only a few handful where the priest is doing that, listing a casta for this person. It was just usually Neofita, an indigenous Californian, as you mentioned, or Razón, gente de Razón. And the books are separate, right? If you go to the missions, so Santa Barbara is the one I've seen the originals of, right? You have the Razón book and you have the Neofita book, right? They're two different records. Um, and so this was an interesting admix, an interesting difference, right, of California, and is I would guess I'm like 90% sure is because it's a frontier area in which they just need these people who speak Spanish and are Catholic, and so they're like,
Right.
we're not going to distinguish it. And you can actually see that in Mexico, right, where you have larger African populations, they would have a separate baptismal book for them. Where you had larger indigenous populations, you have a separate baptismal book, so you'd have the all of the castas, and then you'd have a separate indigenous book. So the idea of having separate books for separate people was normal in Mexico, but here in California, no. And so that has been one of the big mysteries, right? Is that it's not in the baptismal records, which we have almost all of them, which is also somewhat rare. Those don't always survive, and they've been digitized. And so, yeah, I mean, it was actually the first question I asked Steve Hackle when I started this project, because obviously he knew the stuff better. He's like, no, it's not in there. You're gonna have to find it some other way. And and I started with that 1814 questionnaire, right? And I was like, well, guess we're gonna have to do some work here, right? We're gonna have to use some techniques that perhaps haven't been used before, right? And that's why I brought in Dr. Cosmood and the team at Cal Poly. So it's several, there's data science students working on this, and we got a team here. I should have mentioned that we were given a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship last year to do this project, although, like most NEHs, it was canceled by the current administration.
Oh, what a
So,
shame.
without explanation, but I have my theories. I think it was seen as too DEI, I guess, which is a little hilarious being a white guy in charge of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So canceled outright, not put on hold. It's gone.
It's gone. There is a lawsuit pending. And the NEH, the AH, the NEH, not the NEH, AHU, the American Historical Association, the Modern Languages Association, MLA, and I believe maybe APA. The big kind of national organizations
Mm-hmm.
have filed lawsuit that these were illegally canceled, and my name has been added to that. Our project's name has been added to that lawsuit. Um, it's currently supposed to come up for some summarial judgment soon. That doesn't mean anything's going to happen. Uh, I'm not counting my dollars.
Right. Right.
I'm looking for other money now.
Right. Yeah. Isn't that the thing? Is out there looking for money. Have you
Yeah,
gotten much interest or attracted much attention with this project? I would hope so.
Yes, and actually, the California Descendant community have been excellent on this. I mean,
Really, that's great.
yeah, so we started a crowd fund. We actually have a crowd fund site that people can donate to, and they've been really pushing it. And uh, uh, um,
What's the URL of it?
I'll have to send it to you
Okay, you send it to me
of
because
the crowd.
we'll list it in the
Yeah,
show
the crowd
notes.
fund. Um, but yeah, I mean, a lot of people are super interested in it, and part of this comes back to kind of Monica's original comment when she said, "I've been waiting for years for someone to do this project." It's because people would come to the Santa Barbara Mission Archive, they would look up their family ancestry, and they'd be like, "Why is this person listed as a Pardo here?" And a
Mm,
pardo is colonial speak for somebody of African descent,
yeah.
or a mulatto. And she would have to explain, this whole, like, well, did they come from the east? No, 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 they came from Mexico, right? There were people, there were enslaved Africans that came to Mexico, and so those families made their way up through Mexico to California. And so part of it, her interest was just to help have resources to explain it to people doing their own genealogy and people studying California, right? And so, yeah, I've given I try to give as many public talks as I can. As I tell any historical society, I will show up. Just give me a date, I'll be there, right? Because especially with California history or any kind of local history, I don't know, regional history, I guess it would be. I think it's important to kind of pound the pavement, meet people where they're at. Go. So locally, I've talked at the Donna Adobe here and the mission here and the historical society, and I try to hit those as best I can. And I've overwhelmingly people have been very because I think it's something that everyone has seen, but because of the difficulties of studying it, haven't gotten into. And maybe it just takes a whole team of people at Cal Poly to figure this out.
Maybe you're just in the right place.
Yeah,
Um, it's interesting. I just gave a talk down in Santa Barbara at the Santa Barbara
yeah.
Historical Museum, and I don't know if you have or if you haven't. You should reach out to them. They're
I,
always
I
looking.
I
Oh,
will. I mean, like I said, anytime I talk to anybody, I'm like,
yeah,
you just give me a spot, I'll be there. Because that's where you learn. Because people have stuff, right? I've had people literally walk up to me and hand me stuff, their own family research that has been quite helpful,
right.
right?
And it's amazing the number of descendants
Hmm.
who are out there and who are trying to recover their family history. And I think with the digital resources that are now available, people are really able to start digging and finding out fantastic and interesting things about themselves. And like you said, anytime I give a talk, I get people coming up to me saying, I'm a ninth generation Californian, and then boom, all the last names come out and what they've learned about themselves. And so it seems to me that there's a real thirst from people to understand their family history.
So yeah, I mean, one of our goals is we get this website, moving. It's still in the building process, is to have it be something that people could go to, look at, use, and then also feed back on and be like, hey, maybe you missed this and this and this, or I got this bit of information. I am very much open to community sourcing because there's so much out there. Why wouldn't I?
Yeah.
It's impressive research done by individuals out there who are, there's a million stories that I haven't found yet that I'm interested in featuring right on the website, and with the end goal of having this be something that's maybe taught in schools in California. I think this history in teaching in California has been evolving in a positive direction, but still lacks. I think we could do a better job in California of teaching our own history. Um, we actually don't invest as much as some other states in history, right? The state that, as much as people criticize it, the state that invests the most in their history is Texas. They have a historian and they put money into it. And we really don't as much as the states like.
I was going to mention that I was at, the Western History Conference in Albuquerque this last November. And I do have a number of friends who are historians in Texas. And it's just amazing the amount of force there is behind Texas history. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that children have to learn about in elementary school, and junior high, and high school. That's one of my pet peeves. Is here in California, you get fourth grade, and if you blink, you've missed it. And but as you're demonstrating, our history is so rich and so complex that you really should be studying it also at a later age when you can kind of grasp some of the more complex issues and facts, you know?
And I think there's an opportunity. Some of the people who've reached out to me are now teaching the new ethnic studies courses that are in uh, high school classes, right? And they're hoping to add this to that curriculum as well. So I think there's an opportunity right now to be able to talk about it, because I think it helps to, I don't know, have a more honest conversation about our past, because it's complicated. Uh, the Picos as being important, for example, the Picos were horrible to the indigenous population.
Well, right, yeah. If you hear
So,
about if you
so
hear about
it's
the Picos and how they managed, or Pio Pico in particular, how he managed the
absolutely.
missions.
But I think that speaks to like the harder truths of racial hierarchies and structural racism. And so I think it's a very localized but also easy way to talk about those systems in a historical context, which tends to be easier a lot of times than as you get closer to the present. Although obviously it informs the present. Um, to 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 present to middle school, high school, obviously it's already in elementary school. Uh, uh, and I think this is a great starting point, because you can really see how incredibly complicated this is, right? Where it's not, this Euro-American imposition on indigenous population. I mean, there's that, but there's also all this other stuff going on, right? And it's people trying to find spaces to raise up in the hierarchy, and in doing so, pushing other groups out. And so I think a more it's a better way of talking.
Yeah. So, what would you say? I mean, you've said it already in some ways. What would you say this whole project corrects or seeks to correct in terms of our understanding of California history?
Yeah. So there. Yeah. The two ways I've always looked at it is this. So in the United States, writ large, and California history, somewhat gets bundled into this, even though it's a little ingenuine. Uh, you have this, right, Euro-American settler colonialists coming across, uh, you know, so there's the kind of the way of looking at it as like they're imposing themselves onto this area, right, and it's very much white versus people of color. Um, That, in a way, looking at the California case is obviously shows that to be rather erroneous, right? Because there's lots of different groups. It's not just Euro-Americans, it's people of all different ancestries imposing on each other, right? It's,
Right.
some are imposing on others, and it's there's more complication in that. But also, on the other hand, that people of color are also, guilty of oppressing different populations. And so I think in a broader sense, looking at California, and I think it's just because we're so limited on what we teach on California, this narrative has always been there, but just hasn't really played out in terms of like curriculum. I think being highlighting this will help to bring out that complication, and I think have a more honest conversations. Right? We bring up Los Angeles, for example, where I'm talking about the history of how it became was founded by mainly people of color, half of them of African descent. You had recently the scandal there with the city council people on the hot mic saying really derogatory things towards other racial groups, right? And in a city that is quite diverse. And so this people are like, oh, I'm shocked, right, that somebody of a Mexican American would say terrible things about African Americans, and I'm like, well, this is all the history, right? Like I think if we're talking about everything, and maybe this is coming to light, with Cesar Chavez, the revelations about him recently, and part of the reason he was pushed forward was because he was a man, right? And so that not Dolores Huerta, but Cesar Chavez, even though they equally are important, and also not looking at the Filipinos in that movement. So I don't know. It's this idea of as we look and complicate our history more, I think we're able to help to come to terms with the complications we have today in our own society here.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that understanding the history of California from 250 years ago to the present helps us to realize that, it didn't all spring up right after World War II, or it didn't all spring up with the gold rush, or when Silicon Valley came about, that there are deep roots here that connect to regions all over the world, but from the very beginning, right?
Mhm.
Like, even when you think about Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo, sails into San Diego Bay in 1542. And he has, well, first of all, there's the huge controversy about where he is from to begin with, but he has sailors on board who are from all different places in Latin America. He has probably African slaves on board. He has probably mestizo indigenous people on board, Filipino sailors as well. So, I mean, it's a whole mosaic of experiences and cultures from the get-go here
And
in
I mean,
California.
and until the colonization and the 18th century, the mid 1700s, California was visited by the Spanish a lot because it was the end point of the path across the Pacific, right, from the Philippines. So you have them frequently meeting in there. Yeah, I mean, um, I think this is a period that gets skipped, right? I think we're doing more with indigenous history, which is great, right? And we definitely should keep doing that. But it goes from, indigenous and then just kind of like, oh, and then the gold rush. Uh,
Right.
and I think talking about this, especially as the state's demographics change and maybe return more to what they were under the Spanish and the Mexicans. Uh,
Right.
this is a good way of thinking about that and confronting those things.
Well, great. Cameron, is there anything we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
Uh, Not that I can think of, but I would hope that would think of visiting our site, africancalifornias.org, and contributing to the and just so you know, most of our money goes to pay students, not to me. We pay students to do the work on the
Absolutely.
database. So I wish it went more to me, but it mostly goes to students. No, I mean, no, I gotta say, it goes to students, right? And so if you're interested in it, feel free to contact me. I'm here at Cal Poly, and I love to hear from anybody in the public.
Great. Well, I want to thank you for this. Once again, it's a topic that I've really been interested in, and frankly, have fished around to try and find people who are actively working on it, and or who could speak about it. So I'm grateful to have run across your work, and actually, I think maybe you reached out to me first.
Yeah, someone connected us from the California community.
Someone connected us. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for that, and I really hope that what you're doing sort of catalyzes more people to work on this whole area of the African presence, the presence of African descendants in California's history, because there's so much that goes way back, and I think it's a great gift to all of us.
Yeah, in fact, you could argue that we're named after an African queen, Califia, from the novel actually was from Africa. So
Exactly, very true.
and so
That's a good point.
it runs deep in the roots of California.
It really does.
Yeah.
Well, Cameron Jones, I'm really grateful for this, and I'm looking forward to visiting your website, reading your book when it comes out.
It's getting there.
Yeah, we're all
Uh,
in that boat.
yeah.
I feel your pain. It's I've got a project that I'm working on, and it's getting there.
Yeah, yeah. I gotta get the website figured out first, and I think that will help to get the all the stories together that I need for the book.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much.
you're welcome.